Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tech Tactics Live, episode 35. And have I got a treat for you? Of course, we're going to be talking about the 996 GT3, but we are not at PCA headquarters. We are at Speed Motors in Elkridge, Maryland. And I want to say thank you to Bob Miller for hosting us tonight. Not only do we have a 996 GT3, but we've got some other great cars that we're going to talk a little bit during the show. But before we do all of that, I do want to remind you to please like, subscribe, and comment. And for those of you that are watching the show tonight live, be sure to put your name and where you're from in the live chat area, so that way you'll be entered into the raffle to win one of two awesome prizes. We've got the Sportscar Together Festival poster, official poster, as well as the official water bottle for the event. That event is going to be next week, so these aren't even available yet, but we will get two of those out to two lucky winners tonight. So again, thank you to Bob Miller at Speed Motors for hosting us tonight. Thank you to Chip Reichert, which you'll meet a little bit later, who is the owner of the 996 GT3 that we have here tonight. But we also brought in our guests who've a regular, and we just recently released a 3.2 911 video that's going strong on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't watched that yet, check that out. And that's Nathan Mers from Columbia Valley Luxury Cars. What's up, Nathan?
Glad to be here, Vo.
Good. Well, I'm happy to share with you all that not only are we going to see a 996 GT3 tonight, but we're going to kind of go back to the introduction of this video of how a lot of us on staff really love the 996 GT3, so much so that, a decade ago, we were already thinking that this car is destined to be a classic. But the question tonight is it destined to be a classic like this beautiful car right next to me, a 73 Carrera RS? Nathan, tell me a little bit about this special car and why the 996 GT3 might be as successful as this car.
That's a great question, Vu. So for any Porsche file, I think we hold certain cars on pedestals, and the 73 RS, I think, would be one of those pinnacle cars. I think because it represented the best of everything that Porsche was doing up to that moment. And I think the other thing that we don't talk a lot about that makes the 73 RS so unique is, if we reflect back to 73, which actually predates me, I was born in 1975, we already had some sense that with emissions and crash and all the various things that were happening in the world, that we were coming up against an era where change and growth may not be happening at a rapid pace. We were already kind of seeing that cars were becoming less powerful in 73 than they were in 72 and 71, not specifically with Porsche, but with other brands. And so that car had a period of time for probably 15 years. I would really argue the only car that really got to that same much vaunted pedestal would be the 959, which of course we didn't get till the late 80s. And so for a period of almost 15 years, it was the car. If we're just talking road cars, I mean, certainly there's Porsche race cars we could certainly talk about. But for an entire generation, if you will, a decade and a half, this was as good as it got. And so that's a pretty vaunted place to be. And so the question, of course, is a 996 GT3 in that much vaunted place? And so everyone's going to have their opinion. We're going to spend an hour talking about that, so I won't spoil the fun by announcing my idea on it. But it's certainly discussion worthy.
Absolutely. And this particular car, we're actually going to be doing a video on it later on, because this is a very special car. Also has some PCA history, and I won't give away the story. So stay tuned. You'll learn about this car in a video later on. So thank you to the owners for allowing us to have this car here tonight. Let's quickly bring up the agenda so we know what we're going to be talking about for tonight. We're going to be talking about the GT3 compared to the RS. We're going to talk about the difference between a standard 996 and a GT3, what to look for when you're purchasing a 996 GT3, and the state of the current marketplace for a GT3. So before we go into all of that, we were talking about ownership and such. I'd like to bring up Chip Reichert, the owner of this 996 GT3 here, and just give us a few of his impressions, a little bit of history with he and the car. Welcome, Chip, and thank you so much. For those of you watching tonight, we are very lucky that not only are you here, but that you are here with the car, because Hurricane Ida just came through Maryland and for some reason decided to go around exactly where we are tonight. And you drove up on Michelin, I believe, Cup 2s, and you took it easy. You made it here safely. But you got the car here, so thank you so much. And tell us a little bit about the car, when you got it, and what you use it for.
Well, I think getting to this car when I bought it requires a little bit more than just this. I've now been owning and driving Porsches since this month, 1971, so 50 years. Started with a 914, similar to one over here in the corner, and I immediately got into 356s, and including a Speedster, which I still have, and I did a lot of autocrossing. And
I remember seeing you bring that out to an autocross, and I was amazed.
It's still an impressive car.
Absolutely.
But anyway, and that car had a good road racing history. But anyway, then I got into early 911s, probably in the early 80s, including a 911S, which I still have. Had a number of different engines in that. And then, I guess fast forward to 2000, 2001, I started reading about GT3s. It wasn't like you were going to test drive one. And I was at the factory in Stuttgart, had a chance to go through the museum, and I was also went through the assembly line. I see this car coming through, and I see this set of wheels. I'm thinking, what is that? And it happened to be a European GT3. I believe it was a 2001 or 2002. So when I heard, I continued to do the reading on them, and when I heard they were coming into the country, I knew the general manager at one of the local dealerships, Valley Motors at the time, and I talked to him and I said, are you going to be getting any GT3s? He said, well, they're going to make so few of them, I doubt we'll even get one. So I said, well, if you do, I'm interested. So I get a call from him. This was probably in late 2002, November or December. He said he had allocation for one. And I was his first call. And I said, I'll take it. He said, just give me a credit card. We just, so anyway, it came in, the production date was June of '03. So it is a very early car into the country, probably one of the very first. So the driving impression on this car, what it kind of, I had driven some 996 Carreras. They had an entirely different feel than the older air-cooled cars I was accustomed to. But when I first started driving this had a lot of similarities to the older car. Not very forgiving, but you could get an awful lot out of it.
Was your intent initially to get this car to track it, or was it going to be primarily a street car?
Primarily a street car, but after I owned it for about, I guess, 10 years or so, it's about 8 or 9 years. Then I did take it to some DEs just to find out what it was all about, really in more controlled environments where you could take advantage of what the car can do.
Absolutely.
And, did a few things to it. We did put a half a roll bar in just for safety reasons. But what that, and I was mentioning to Bob, that the car with the stock seats, which are back in it now, at events, and I'll use Sebring, for example, there was a speed I was able to attain down the back straight with this configuration. Before I put the roll bar, and then I put a cup seat, Hans device, etc., was strapped in pretty securely, and all of a sudden I was picking up 12, 13 miles an hour down the back straight.
You're way more confident with all that safety equipment.
Exactly, just the safety equipment, and also being pretty well harnessed in. So, I mean, everything about the car from the factory was awfully good. The seats are very good, but not really for that application.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for bringing it. We're going to hop and talk some technical stuff on it.
Very good.
And just relax.
Thank you.
Nathan, you still there for me?
I sure am.
All right. So, GT3 996 came out, I believe, at the Geneva Auto Show in like 1999 or something, right? But we didn't get it here in the States until as an '04 model. This is I think he said he picked it up in '03, but it's an '04 model. And they only made '04 and '05s in the US.
You are correct. Yeah, there is a lot of us think of this as the first GT3 because, of course, we're American-centric, but in Europe they have the first generation, a 996 first gen GT3. There's quite a bit of difference between that car and the car that we got as Gen 2, which they also got, but very connected. So yeah, if you have the opportunity to drive a European one of the early generation cars, also a great car to try out. But again, we didn't get that car here, unfortunately, nor did we get the second generation RS that Porsche brought us. So kind of a little bit of a bummer there.
What's interesting is I think I've seen, so there's a lot of us that have 996s, right? And, 996 owners that have the standard 996 often dream that their 996 will one day be like a GT3. And one of the things that is very popular is people put the aero kits on. I've seen lots of Gen 1 GT3 aero kit cars, body kitted cars, but not Gen 2. Have you noticed that as well?
Yeah, I think the early first gen 996, particularly the 99, and I'm not really sure why this is the case. The aero kit, while it's unusual, I wouldn't label it extraordinarily rare. By the time you get past, say, 01 and you get into the second generation cars, you don't see too many of the aero kit cars. Some part of me wonders if the person that was drawn to the aero kit did eventually order a 996 GT3. Whereas we certainly didn't get a first generation GT3, so the aero kit is as close as you could get, at least aesthetically. So that might be some of it.
Yeah. So I'll tell you why I think the 996 GT3 is probably maybe not at the level, because I think this is the end of the run, long hood car. There's a lot of reasons why the Carrera RS is what it is, but like I really started doing DEs and getting active in PCA mid 2000s, and when I went out to the DEs and at the track, the people that were in the red run group, the fast folks, the instructors and such, they had GT3s, and to me they were just amazing to see them perform, and just they just sounded different, and the high was it 8600 RPMs, and they were just very, very specific tools for the job. And I've always thought, I love 996s. I don't think that's a secret. And so to see sort of the best iteration of the 996 in a GT3 was always the hero car for me.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, if you think about, guys, say of our generation, you and I are 40-somethings. Certainly, we weren't at the track when someone was piloting a 73 RS. And the one thing I recall, because like you, I was doing some track time in the late 90s, early 2000s. And when the first 996 GT3s came out, it was such a radical change of just velocity and capability compared to what was out there, because guys were running, prepped 993s, because you didn't really see a lot of, like, for example, 993 RSs, 964 RSs on this side of the pond at least. And so most people were running, more standard configuration, say 993s, 964s were the fastest cars out there. And a 996 GT3 performance envelope is a radical departure. Whereas, like, for example, if you go 992 GT3s are just starting to hit the ground, while they're an amazing car, it's not night and day change in performance envelope over, say, a 991.2. But I just remember those first GT3s, seeing those, and they're just decimating what else was out there. And it was such a wholesale change, and it's something that's kind of seared in your memory. And my guess is there's a lot of people of that generation where it's seared in a way that, is going to hold a lot of sort of horsepower in their head, over time. It's sort of an iconic car, much the same way that 73 RS might have been for someone 20 years prior, because it was such a pinnacle car at that moment in time.
I think what has made it iconic for me is when I had the opportunity to drive our past president, Kirk Gibson's GT3. To the untrained eye, a 996 GT3 and a Carrera that has has an aero kit on it, they're not that, again, to the untrained eye, many people wouldn't understand how different those cars are. But having driven both, they really are night and day. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what makes that so. Starting with dry sump versus wet sump.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about, to your point, I've long thought one of the things that's held values back on 996 GT3s is that they are visually the most restrained of any GT car of modern history, right? They really sort of represent the vein or a style that, you know, started with the 964 RS, which is a very restrained car visually. The 993 RS adds a little bit more, and then this car is pretty restrained. By the time you move to the 997 GT3, and certainly by 991, now all restraint went out the window visually, right? And so one of these cars can kind of sneak below the radar, which can sometimes then fool a person to think, oh, I can add an aero kit and I can add GT3 wheels and maybe I can put a set of coilovers on it and I'm going to make myself a GT3 light that'll be, you know, 95% as good for a third the money. And it's a nice sentiment to have, but they're fundamentally under the skin different cars. So something as simple as they start with a different tub. They start with a Carrera 4 tub. They don't start with a regular Carrera 2 tubs. They have a stiffer Carrera 4 tub. As you say, the engine,
narrow body tub,
it's a narrow body.
Yeah.
You know, like the turbo, for example, used the wide body as did the 4S. So narrow body Carrera 4 tub. And then, of course, the architecture of the engine is so different. So one of the running jokes, of course, when these things pop up on a forum or Bring a Trailer, people always jokingly ask about the IMS. Well, Mesker motors don't have an IMS bearing, so
right.
That doesn't even come into play. And to your point, dry sump versus wet sump. You know, Porsche's historically, all the way through the end of air-cooled production, used a Mesker-based motor with a dry sump, basically a separate oiling system, an oil tank. The modern cars, starting with the M96 that came out in the Boxster and then the subsequent 996, of course, use a standard oiling system, wet sump, just like every other car on the market would have. And so they have a very different design intent, a very different purpose, and that carries through on everything. So, for example, the transmission, it's carried over from the 996 Cup car. It's designed to be rebuilt. It's designed to be re-geared, right? The suspension comes from the factory. Not only does it sit 33 millimeters lower, but it comes from the factory with height adjustable coilovers. They're designed for, you know, additional camber. They're designed for all these things that you would have if you were going to take the car to the track. You know, one of the best things about Porsche is you can take the most basic equipped Porsche and really do fine at the track. But a GT3 is a whole nother level. And so
and I think what's
it's
also
not so
interesting
simple
about the GT3 during this time period of its introduction, like this car was purchased with a specific use in mind. Like it is the proper track tool. And I think in today's market, you and I had talked about it earlier, was that, you know, there are enthusiasts out there that are buying track specific models, but not necessarily using them on the track.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one thing I will say, just so I don't ever get accused of having a bias, I'm never of the opinion that a particular model by default is better than another model. And what do I mean by that? Like, I'm not by default saying a GT3 is better than a regular 996. It all depends on your intended use case. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of use cases, a regular 996 is a better tool for that job, right? But if you're talking an absolute performance track-oriented tool, you know, the best tool that you could have bought in the Porsche toolbox in 2004, I believe, was the GT3, right?
Right.
So, you know, it's not that, again, it's denigrating a regular 996. In a lot of situations, I would find a regular 996 to be a more pleasurable, usable item, actually probably 90% of the time. In fact, one of the things I dislike about GT cars is that there's, and I'll blame men for this, women tend to not fall in this camp, but our ego says, well, if there's a, quote, better car and I can afford it, well, therefore I've got to buy that car, right? So they won't even, for example, consider a base Carrera or Carrera S because they say, well, if there's a GT3, I have to have that car. And it's like, well, it depends on how you're going to use it. You may actually find in a lot of circumstances the regular car is a better fit. And one of the things you'll notice with Porsche, technology has come a long way. And so, for example, if you drive a new 992 GT3, its ability to sort of multitask and move into more of a driver situation because of the fact that we've got adaptive dampening and our technology package is better. It does a better job of making that compromise. A 996 GT3, while you could use it as your everyday car, it's a pretty difficult car to live with on the street, and that's not a bad thing, right?
Well, I mean,
you
it
gotta
depends
go in
on
knowing-
when you said that, though, because back in the day, when these cars had dropped to maybe $60,000, $50,000, it's because they said, well, man, these cars, yeah, they're a great track tool, but you take a beating driving them on the street. So all of a sudden, people were looking more towards, 997 GT cars because they are a little bit more compliant. The technology had made them more livable as a street car. So these kind of got left behind for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where, every car you have to kind of think like who the intended buyer or user is. And so at the Porsche GT world, there's a couple different types of buyers. The very common buyer, the buyer that Porsche loves, then the buyer that I love because it makes my job possible, is they always have to have the latest and greatest, right? Yep. So they had a 996 GT3 until a 997 GT3 came out, and they traded it for that. Then they traded it for a .2 into a 991 into a .2, and now they're probably waiting in line for their new 992 to hit the ground, right? There's that person, and they want the latest and greatest, and that's going to be the most relevant car at the track when they go to their local, track day or DE event, right?
Yeah.
There's that kind of buyer. There's also the kind of buyer who, they have the car and they're a long-term hold, like Chip. I love the fact that Chip has owned this car, for going on almost 20 years now, from 2003 to now, right? 18 years. That's pretty unusual. I mean, one of the things you'll notice when you look at the used 996 GT3 market, all of them have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 owners, right? Because again, they get into that weird space where for a guy who wants the fastest car at a track day event, a 996 GT3 is no longer going to be it. It's not competitive in that regard anymore, right? They don't make an amazingly great road car or everyday car for most people, right? So that kind of rules that person out. So now they're sort of transitioning to a different demographic, either a person who is yearning for a more pure elemental experience, which I think is a very valuable experience to have, or sadly, or not sadly is the wrong word, but there's a desire for people from a collector standpoint, right?
Yeah.
That
So
I'm
of the camp where this car is just one of the last pure cars, and that's why I relate it to the RS, because I mean, it came out as a track tool. Most people that bought it used it as a track tool. It came in limited quantities, and unfortunately there's probably been a good number of cars that didn't survive track usage because it was a handful to drive, because there isn't a whole lot of technology to keep you on the track, right? So now you talk about supply and demand. A pure thoroughbred car developed by the factory, weren't many to begin with, not many survived track days, and to find a one owner condition car, 20-some thousand miles, like it's now becoming a true unicorn. And for those of you that were on the live chat, blaming us for maybe driving the prices up by doing this show tonight, trust me, that boat was already sailing. We're just talking about it tonight. These cars are amazing cars if this is what you're looking for. I think it's a very specific buyer, and if you appreciate that purity of it, that's why I think it's so close to the RS. And the difference is the 996 is still within a mortal's limit, whereas the RS, thankfully there are people that can own this car, but I'll never see this car in my garage. This car, possibly, if I don't wait too long, right?
No, that's a very good point. I mean, as pricing on all Porsche come up, right? I always think that, people, if they have a certain amount of money they've allocated to essentially what we all know is a toy, right, or sort of an extravagance, they cross shop and they say, okay, so let's say I have $100,000 to spend for a fun Porsche. Well, it used to be that bought a pretty outrageous air-cooled car. Now, that doesn't even necessarily get me an outrageous air-cooled car, depending on what era I'm looking for. And all of a sudden, a 996 GT3 checks a lot of boxes, right? It's limited production. It's got a performance envelope, which is unbelievable. It's got great history and lineage with Porsche. It's something special, and it always will be. And I think the design is aging well. So, when I see people pay, and I just dropped that video yesterday on the 3.2 Carrera, which I love 3.2 Carreras, but I'm getting over $100,000 for high quality 3.2 Carreras. And this is not denigrating a 3.2 Carrera, but if I were going to spend similar money, would I rather spend that on a 996 GT3? I won't say one way or the other, but it's certainly worthy of consideration. In fact, I guess I probably will say, I think if I could only have one of those two for similar money, I think I'd probably pick the 996 GT3.
Smart man, smart man. Before we get into the walk around of the car, let's throw up our winners for the raffle tonight. Congratulations to Craig from the Suncoast region and Richard from Musicstat. Guys, make sure you reach out to us through the live chat, and we'll get the Sportscar Together Fest poster and water bottle out to you. And let me see. So I'm going to be walking away from my laptop. I won't be able to monitor the live chat, but I think this is a great opportunity for us, Nathan, to start from the front of the car and work our way back and just sort of pretend like we're shopping for one. We happen to find one locally here in Maryland, right? So now we have it at a shop that's probably gonna do PPI, so we know the true statistics of the car with a third person looking at it. But as we do the walk around, Damon's gonna follow along with the camera here. If there's anything that you wanna look at, Nathan, let me know. But right up front, I can tell this car's been on the track. It's got 20-some thousand miles, but I certainly see chips and nicks on the hood. And to be honest with you, I would wear those chips and nicks as a badge of honor. This car is being driven, which is what it was meant to be. It would be almost shameful to have a perfectly preserved front end, because I would look at that as possibly it's been repainted. It doesn't match the mileage. What do you think? What are you looking for up front, Nathan?
Well, I mean, basically, when you're dealing with this era of Porsche, buyers are pretty well informed and they're pretty boring. I hate to say it. So basically, if you're looking for one, you're basically going to get the following 6 derivations of questions, and they're all going to be on this realm. It's going to be track use. Has it been on the track? How much? Right? That's going to be one of the questions. Closely related to that, what mods are on the car? Coolant pipes is going to be the next big question. Have they been welded or pinned? The question about that. People are going to want to know about the Carfax. They're going to want to know about paint meter readings, and they're going to want to know about overrevs. I mean, those are the things that people are going to ask. So whether you're buying or selling one, you're going to encounter those 6 questions in some form or another. Getting to your paint question, one of the things that's interesting about 996 GT3s is they really usher in the first era where we had widespread usage of paint protection film. Prior to that, you had paint protection film, but not widely used, and it was really coming into fashion in this era. So you actually still will find a fair number of these cars that someone took the time to protect them when they were new with paint protection film. Oftentimes not the full coverage we get now, but you see a lot of them that may have had a half hood, half front fenders, things like that. And that product usually does a pretty good job. I do get a little concerned when I see the film is 15 years old and yellowed and looks like an old toenail. Sometimes removing that can be difficult. But you do still see cars that didn't have film, maybe like this one where they have some chips. Whereas the funny thing is, try to go find a new GT3 now that does not have film on. It almost doesn't exist. I mean, I can't even remember the last time I saw one. It's a given. It's not whether it has film. It's who installed it and which product they used, right? But for rock chips, you're right. I mean, you're going to take a car and you're going to use it. You're going to get rock chips. And it's just a fact of life.
I'm happy to see these rock chips as opposed to an early version of a partial hood wrap that will probably be yellow, and or if you decide to peel that early technology of paint protection, then you're going to have 2 different shades on the hood. Just leave it just like this. Now today, paint protection film is so much better, and they can actually wrap the whole hood. That's a different story. But when this car was introduced, third hoods were very common, and they didn't do fenders. So you would have like this mismatch of protection, and I've always thought, I'd rather just leave it all off. And that's what this owner has done. I noticed the lip spoiler. These cars are pretty low, and I know the lip spoilers on GT3s are, how would I say, can be considered disposable, because if you're not careful, I think they're designed to just pop off, and they do pop off. So I don't know if Chip, if this is your second one at least, maybe. It's still your first one. Okay, so you've done well. Okay, but it does pop off, right? Oh yeah. All right, so walking down the sides, well, you can't help but notice, of course, being a Gen 2 996, it has a different headlights from the first generation that is different from, say, a Boxster of the same year. The wheels, the GT3 wheels, to me are probably one of the most gorgeous designs. I believe it's a ½ inch wider than the standard Carrera wheel up front, and 1 inch wider in the back. But the design of this sort of has like the traditional Fuchs kind of design implemented into it, and it just, to me, it's a beautiful wheel. And behind it you see standard steel brakes, which for track use I think that's perfectly good. I know this car did have an option to have ceramic brakes. What does steel brakes versus ceramic brakes do for you in terms of when you go buy this car, Nathan?
So these cars have the first generation PCCBs. I don't know the exact production, but it seems like maybe about a third of them had carbons, maybe not quite that high. The first generation carbons caused a lot of consternation for people because the consumable cost was extremely high. And so there was a big fear that, if used in a track situation, they can crack or develop failures. And of course, then the replacement cost would be staggering. And so a lot of people felt that if you were going to take it to the track, a steel braked car would be advantageous. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see a lot of cars that originally were carbon brake cars that have been swapped to steel brakes. What I will say is, in today's world where less people are tracking them, a very low mileage collector quality car with carbons will bring a premium over a steel brake car, but a driver quality car with carbons gives people some pause, right?
Okay.
So
they don't want to be the one kind of caught holding the hot potato.
Exactly. So yeah, if I find one of these that has 8,000 miles and it's got carbon brakes, I think that's advantageous. If I see one that's had significant track time and it's got 50,000 miles and it's wearing its carbon brakes, I'm a little bit wary. I'm also a little bit wary for a car that was originally spec'd with carbons that no longer has them, because in the Porsche world, fair or not fair, the next buyer, that makes them upset. Well, why doesn't it have the brakes it was delivered with? And so your ideal situation is if someone very, tidily packed away the original parts and it comes with the car. That's kind of a win-win if you get that situation. But sometimes now that they've been 7 or 8 owners, those parts went missing along the way, sadly.
Yep. So we walk down the side. I noticed the cowl, even the mighty GT3 suffers from faded cowl like all other 996s, but that's an easy component piece to
Cheap
replace.
Part,
Yep. Probably one of the cheapest upgrades you can do for a 996. Non-sunroof. If I'm not mistaken, all GT3s are non-sunroof, right? 996 GT3s?
All 996 GT3s. In fact, that was one of the big beefs with the 997 GT3 is it got a sunroof, right? So these were non-sunroof cars, as God intended them to be, right?
As intended for a purpose-built race car. I'm going to let Damon come around here. Now this is where it's going to confuse you a little bit, because if you look inside this GT3 as compared to, say, the same year 911 C2, to the untrained eye, it looks pretty standard. It looks like the standard 996. It's got sports seats, which in the GT3 came standard as opposed to an option. If you look at the door panels, you notice that if you have a 996, you notice that there are no speakers in the door panels because the music is coming from the back of the car. You don't need more speakers to play through the doors or anything like that. Door handles are standard. It's not like some kind of special cloth door pull like in other kind of GT cars might have. It's got a full leather dash. It's pretty well appointed. Am I missing? Oh, there. So what I've noticed in some GT3s, but I haven't been able to find a picture, the center stack right in front of the shifter, how common is that deleted?
It's very common, and it's an easy delete if you have a car with black interior. Porsche sadly discontinued the center console delete parts for any color other than black.
Oh.
But really, you just remove that little panel there, and there's a little couple carpet pieces and a plastic piece of trim that snaps in place. It's a few $100 from your local Porsche dealer. And for a taller guy like me, it's a great addition. In fact, I've done it to my 996 Turbo and my 986 Boxster. I think it's a nice upgrade. I think that the CD shelf was like a $45 option when these cars were new. A lot of them have it, but the delete is nice. But to your point, yeah, the interior, if you're not paying attention, there's very few definitive differences. Probably the biggest difference, frankly, is the tack. It says GT3 and it's got an 8,200 RPM redline. Even the door panels, those are the same door panels you would have got if you didn't get any hi-fi audio options.
Right.
And the seats are just the standard sport seats. Here in the U.S., we did not get the Recaro buckets that were available in rest of world markets, but a pretty common upgrade if you can find those are pretty slick.
Nathan, in this era GT3, was Alcantara introduced yet? Like this car doesn't have any Alcantara. When did Alcantara kind of become?
It should have an
sort of the
Alcantara
standard?
headliner,
Oh, does it?
doesn't it? Yeah.
Oh, it does.
Should.
Look at that.
Yeah,
so it
yeah.
has Alcantara headline, but it doesn't have like Alcantara steering wheel or Alcantara shifter.
No, I mean,
was that available back then?
Porsche was just dipping their toe into the options foray, so you could get quite a bit of leather, you could get a lot of aluminum, you could get carbon fiber. They didn't yet have Alcantara as a standalone, kind of in the same way like carbon wood aluminum is now. But you could get, deviated stitching, you could get full leather, you could get all sorts. You could even get leather visors on the GT3, which to me is a little bizarre, but you'll see them every so often. In fact, I recently sold a 996 GT3 that had like $30,000 worth of leather and trim and stitch, which again was cool because it was a low mileage car. It was a little bit disjointed to me as a track car. It's bizarre to have leather sun visors, but nevertheless, right?
So I'm going to bring Chip because he's going to give us a little bit more details on his interior here.
Well, this car, the main option was the paint. The only other options on the car, that has a smaller steering wheel.
Oh, a smaller
Than
diameter
standard.
steering wheel. So that's a special order.
And believe it, yes.
Oh.
Yep.
And believe it or not, it has footwell lighting. So,
So you can see your fancy footwork while you're driving at night.
Well, just to get in and out
Okay.
at night. But that is an optional steering wheel,
Oh.
which was from the factory.
Oh, wow.
So I
Interesting.
just wanted to point that out because
Thank you.
One of the only options on it.
So I'm going to make a statement that's probably going to get me in trouble. I love the Alcantara headliner, and honestly, that's the only place I really like Alcantara. Like, I love just a standard smooth leather steering wheel. I like leather on my shifter. I like leather on the e-brake. I like leather on the seats. I don't know. I mean, are you more of an Alcantara fan? And please don't send hate mail if you love Alcantara. I'm just giving you my little personal opinion.
I like it functionally. I don't like how it wears long term.
That's
Particularly
my
the steering
problem.
wheel and shift knob. Yeah, they tend not to wear very well. They feel nice when they're nice and new, and I like the seats. When it's hot out, you don't stick to them. I do like that component of it. But yeah, long term, give me leather.
When I drive a car that has Alcantara, I feel like I'm wearing a white shirt and eating a bowl of spaghetti. Like, I just feel like I'm going to mess it up if I use it too much. So just give me a standard leather and I'll be a happy person. Anyways, so let's see. This car has a aftermarket roll bar for doing DEs. No back seats in a GT3. So if you're looking to take two little ones along in your GT3, that is not an option, or at least not a legal option. The back wheels and brakes, not much to talk about there, other than they are gorgeous wheels. They've a very different wing than the taco wing of the MK1 body kit. This is the MK2. To me, it's just a gorgeous car. Very understated, very purposeful, very clean lines. What's not to like? Anything else that I'm looking for as I walk back here? Maybe we can open the engine lid and see probably the most exciting part of the car, and then you can talk about that, Nathan. What are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, the
in
thing
here?
about 996 is, is that, pretty much everything is shared in terms of what you would be looking at from interior standpoint, functionality, body paint, all that stuff. Whether you're inspecting a regular 996 or a 996 GT3, that stuff would be in common. In terms of the engines, however, obviously a completely different animal. And again, to the big question you're always going to get is you're going to get a question about coolant lines. And this could be its own, hour-long tech session. So let's not go too far down the road here, except to say the question is going to come up, and the opinions kind of go along this spectrum. The basic concept is the cooling lines in the block itself. Porsche used a form of adhesive to hold those in place. We have found that over time that can fail, and if it fails catastrophically, meaning that it blows off at speed, that can spew coolant underneath and around the car, which could lead to an accident for either the car or someone following them. So in a track environment, there's some concern about that. Obviously, you don't want to be the guy who sends the guy behind you into the wall. So I think for a car that you're taking to the track, I think it behooves you to do it. The question is, do you do it on a street car? And again, everyone's going to have their opinion about that. I would be of the view for a very low mileage, more of a garage clean, take to cars and coffee, collectible mileage car, I would probably just watch for any warning signs, which would typically be the smell of coolant or any sort of leaks. And I would probably take the risk. That's my opinion. But if I was going to drive the car in a more aggressive fashion, I would probably just do it when I was doing a more invasive engine service, like when it was due for a clutch. I would probably just budget to make that update. I always get the question of like, well, is someone going to be upset from the originality police if you've done that? I would view it as a good maintenance practice, and I don't think someone's going to carp you. There might be somebody, but I think it's probably reasonably well understood. So that's the coolant line issue. Other stuff, the motors themselves are unbelievably robust. You simply do not see failures. Closer related to that, of course, is the over-rev report. People think that, God himself inscribes on some sort of stone tablet somewhere when you've been bad, and we pull up the over-rev report and we look at that and we decide if the car's good or bad. These cars were kind of dummy. They only stored stage 1 and stage 2 over-revs. And I can tell you from a market standpoint, if you have a significant number of stage 2 over-revs, the market will punish you for that.
Explain what is a stage 1 versus stage 2 over-rev.
Yeah, so basically the DME, or the car's computer, will store anytime you over-rev the car, which is when you take the engine speed past the Porsche design limit, which in this case is 8,200 RPM. Now, Porsche actually will state that the car's good for 9,000 RPMs with its titanium rods, but they gave it a more conservative rev limit of 8,200. It has a soft limiter that comes in at 78. And so I believe on these cars, stage 1 is anywhere up to the limit at 8,200, and a stage 2 is any rev which is over that. A lot of people think, well, if you have a rev limiter, how could you possibly over rev a car? Well, you can do, the most common way is what we call the money shift, which is you're going down the back straight, you go to grab fifth gear, and you accidentally get too aggressive with your downshift, and you grab third, and you quickly zing that car up to 9, 10, 12,000 RPM, right? That's the most common way you do it. You can also do it if the car becomes airborne, or if you rev the car in neutral, which God only knows why you'd want to see 9,000 RPMs in neutral.
That's on you if you did that.
But basically, if I were looking to buy a car and it had a significant number of stage 2 over revs, I would look at the time since it's last been over revved. So you can look at total engine hours. And the general rule of thumb is about 50 hours. And so let's say the car has 3,000 hours on it and the last over rev was at 800 hours. Well, it wouldn't have gone another 2,200 hours if there would have been significant damage. But if I run the report and the over rev happened 30 minutes ago, well, okay, I'm going to have some significant pause. I am going to, however, recognize if I see some stage twos, sadly in our market, there'll be buyers that car is just dead to them. It's sort of akin to having anything negative on the Carfax.
Mm-hmm.
Fair or not fair, some buyers panic about that. So it's worth running one. I don't think it's the end-all be-all that people think it is, but it's a piece of information you should probably know.
So you're talking about how robust this engine is. You talked about how this doesn't have the IMS bearing that we usually talk about when you're talking about a 996. In terms of maintenance and such, I'm looking here at the coolant tank here that from my 996 experience, I know these coolant tanks in the 996 crack and leak and stuff like that, and you have to replace that. They time out, they get yellow. Motor mounts in a 996 sometimes go bad. I see these are kind of more higher performance motor mounts. Are there other similar maintenance items on this car to a standard 996 that you have to watch out for?
Yeah, I mean, the coolant tanks are weak, like they are on any of these cars over here. They just get, heat cycled and the plastic becomes brittle and they can start leaking. But it's not a massive job. In fact, it's one of the few jobs as a kind of an enthusiast you can feel like you're getting your tools out and doing some work. So that's kind of fun. But really, keep the oil changed. They just don't have like a lot of major foibles. Unlike air-cooled Metzger motors, they're not generally leakers. So you don't
these
see
are
these
not
things being
leakers,
really.
you're saying?
They're not. I mean, it's everyone talks about rear main seal leaks. In my experience, a couple of them came from the factory with leaks early on. But you look at a 15-year-old GT3, and if it's not leaking, I've yet to see one randomly start leaking from the rear main. And they don't have the typical leaks like you see, again, on even, say, 993s, 964s, even though the case architecture is pretty much the same, right? They can, all the other consumables, they're not terribly hard on brakes if they're not used on the track. They, of course, are very hard on rear tires. I noticed Chip there is running the Michelin Pilot Sport Cups, which, of course, tread life there is dismal, but that's not the purpose of them. The purpose of them is to be utterly grippy. But no, I mean, they're. I really don't see a lot of things to warn people off of.
So we're going to bring the car up and take a look at underneath. While that's going on, does mileage concern you?
It doesn't concern me. It certainly factors in a consideration. The average consumer sees mileage as the single biggest, most important thing. The way I always describe mileage to people is that two things. One, we should pay a premium for mileage because it, in theory, should be a bellwether of the overall condition of the car, both aesthetically and mechanically, right? And so I want to buy a car where the mileage is in alignment with the quality of the car as it presents, again, mechanically and cosmetically. And why I say that is sometimes you'll see a car that shows a higher than normal odometer reading, but when you look at the car, you're like, wow, it's almost uncanny how this car was able to be used this much and not show wear. And on the flip side, sometimes you'll see a car with a remarkably low odometer reading that just looks like it's lived a really, really hard life. I want those things to be in alignment. You don't see a ton of high mileage of these cars. There are some users out there that are active on the forums that have well over 100,000 miles on them, and God bless them, and they're not seeing a lot of problems. But the bulk of the cars you'll find in the market have somewhere between 25 and 55, 60,000 miles. I mean, that's the pretty typical range. And again, as long as the price was reflective of the mileage, I would have no concerns of a higher mileage car, if it checks out PPI and I've got a good service history.
Good. All right, so now we've got the car up, and probably the first thing that jumps out at me when I look underneath of here is that the case is stamped with 964.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about that, because obviously this is a 996.
Yeah. So as we know, and this is again not denigrating the regular 996s in any way, but the architecture, the M96 motor that Porsche used in the 996, their primary goal, or what they really needed to accomplish, was a reduced cost to build the car. right? I mean, they just simply could not keep building cars at what it used to cost them to build 964s and 993s, right? And so one of the things that they realized is the Metzger-based motor is a very expensive motor to build. It has unique left and right side parts, for example. So one of the really cool innovations of an M96 is that the parts are all mirror image. And so there isn't a left and a right side set of pistons and cylinders, as an example. They flip them 180 degrees. And so that's why they went that route, is they had to make it more cost effective to build. But they knew the Metzger has 40 years of Porsche racing experience, and they knew that this car was going to see track duty, and they needed to have a proven platform, which is why they stock with this one. So again, that's one of the reasons that they're so prized, because there is that lineage. And I think Chip said it well. He said, when I drove this car, it felt connected to my air-cooled cars of yore. Well, one of the things that makes an air-cooled car an air-cooled car is the engine architecture, because it has a very distinct sound. Mm-hmm. And even though this is water-cooled and there's lots of changes, when you start this car up and you hear it idle, it harkens back to the cars of yore. And an M96 is a very good sounding motor too, particularly if you have factory sport exhaust, but it has a very different auditory soundtrack.
Right.
So for us people stuck in the past, man, does this thing sound sexy.
Now, true to your observation, I haven't seen underneath of Chip's car until now, and it's clean as a whistle, no drops of oil. I see these must have been added. I don't think these are factory. This is something he added for towing or something like that for the track.
Tie downs.
This piece is new to me. What is this? It's like a case protection piece, I believe. It looks factory.
Yeah, it's a good question.
It
looks like he's got
this is a piece to protect, in case you have low, low clearance or something like that, and something hits this instead of hitting the case. But I'm not so sure that works out well for the rest of the bolt and the rest of the case. But anyways, over here, very different from a 996. You mentioned it earlier. The suspension there, adjustable from the factory, a factory race piece.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the one thing that's cool, one of my favorite things about a 996 GT3, and it's funny, but it's the first Porsche that I recall seeing sitting on a dealer showroom floor, and I thought it almost looks like it went to a tuner as opposed to a manufacturer. I mean, they have the most unbelievably perfect ride height from the factory and wheel fitment. I mean, it's like, you almost always have to take a new Porsche and adjust the ride height and add wheel spacers. And I remember walking up to this when it was brand new in the Porsche dealer, and I almost thought, man, this dealer's already adjusted the ride height and put wheel spacers on it, because the fitment is just so good. They just got it dialed, Yeah.
And let's move towards the front here, and let's just show a picture, and I'm going to challenge those that are watching. Something around here did not come with this car from the factory. So while you guys decide what didn't come with the car factory, let's go back to what Nathan was talking about in terms of the car setup from the factory. Most cars are set up to understeer so that, bad drivers and not so great drivers can, survive a bad situation, right? But this car is set up from the factory and can be set up even further to handle as a sports car should and not have that understeer or less of it. Talk about that, because you had mentioned that earlier in our conversation.
Yeah, one of the things that hopefully we don't have too many German natives here, because we'll pick on them a little bit, but they always tend to think they're a little bit superior in the natural gift and driving ability. So they have this thought process which basically says they always dial in a little bit of operator error when they dial in factory suspension setup, knowing that the average driver is more confident and more comfortable in an understeer situation than an oversteer situation. And so that's by design, right? And the 996 GT3 actually came set up from the factory, probably one of the most neutral setup of any car I've ever driven, with its factory alignment and suspension settings. And I think in some ways that's one of the reasons that of the 959 that we got delivered here in the U.S., that so many of them left the road so early, because
the Germans were right.
They have, yeah, well, maybe they just They have an incredibly high performance envelope. They have a lot of stick. The sport cups need to get warmed up a little bit. And there's no nanny other than ABS. There's no nanny to save your bacon.
Yeah.
And if you overcook a corner and think it's going to reward you with just a little bit of understeer to save you, no, this thing's going to come around hard and it's going to come around fast, which makes it a hell of a lot of fun. But if you weren't expecting it, or if you came out of, say, a regular 996 and expected it to perform in a similar fashion, it just wasn't going to do that. And so someone I was talking to, I think maybe Annie or something, was saying he remembers going to track events, and literally 2 and 3 of these cars hitting the walls in one weekend,
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's the mystique of this car, is it just utterly demands your respect, and your ability to drive needs to be in check so that you can go home with the car. So to answer the question of what's not factory on this car or didn't come with it are these control arms. These are beefier control arms, I believe from a 997, and the owner, Chip, put these on because he was tracking at some pretty bumpy tracks. I believe it was Sebring, and this was just a preventative measure to put something beefier on the car, and it's worked out well for him. But that did not come with the car from the factory, but it fits perfectly and it works out great, and he has a sort of a stronger foundation suspension. So you see some other race parts here, some factory brake ducting, again, purpose-built street car. But if we haven't convinced you that this GT3 is possibly one of the coolest Porsches that was ever built, maybe someday getting to Carrera RS, or you need a more specific track tool, let me introduce you to this car back here, a 996 Cup car. Now, we are at the top of the hour, and we won't have time to talk about the Cup car, but perhaps if you guys are interested, maybe in the future, we'll do a video on how to buy a 996 or what to look for when buying a 996 Cup car, because I think this car is also special, and man, could you have a lot of fun on track with this one. So let me walk back and wrap up the show. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you to Bob Miller at Speed. Thank you to our sponsor, Pirelli, for making Tech Tactics Live. Please be sure, if you enjoyed the show, hit the like button. It really helps with our statistics and our metrics. Be sure to comment, subscribe, and until I see you next time, have fun out there, enjoy the drive, and we'll see you later.